Okay, I want to look at the death and resurrection of Jesus. First thing you have to realize, it's really, really important, and this is, if you're going to remember one thing, this is what I want you to remember. That the Gospels were written to explain the experience of the death and resurrection of Jesus. Remember, the Gospels were written not during Jesus' lifetime. They were written after Jesus had already been crucified and after he had already been raised. So they were written to explain the experience of the death and resurrection of Jesus. The Gospels are not like a novel where you start at the beginning of the story and you read through to the end. The Gospels need to be read more like a flashback. And then you read the novel knowing what the end is. And as you read the novel, you come to understand the conclusion better. The Gospels should be read more like a flashback. Most people don't read the end of the novel first, but that's what we're doing in the Gospels. We're reading the end first. So then you can understand what happened at the beginning. The apostles of Jesus saw Jesus die, and they had the experience of the resurrection. So they were forced to ask the questions in light of the unexpected death and the type of death that Jesus experienced. And then the resurrection. What does the death and resurrection mean? What do these experiences mean? What does it say about Jesus as the Messiah? And what does it say about what Jesus' mission was? The death and resurrection were completely unexpected. We are so used to, as Christians, talking about the death and resurrections of Jesus that we fail to realize how absolutely unexpected, how absolutely mind-blowing that whole experience was for the first apostles and disciples of Jesus. It was beyond anything they expected. So when they experienced the death and resurrection of Jesus, in order to answer the question of what did it mean to say Jesus was the Messiah, they had to return to their experience of Jesus when he was still with them, walking around with them, and they were listening to him, and he was preaching, and he was healing. And they had to take a second look at everything Jesus did in light of the death and resurrection of Jesus. So that's what we need to do. We need to look at the story of Jesus by looking at the end of the story first, before we go back and look at the actual events of Jesus' life. So the disciples went back and they looked at the events of Jesus' life, and they looked at them through the lens of the death and resurrection. And when the life of Jesus was examined through this new experience of his death and resurrection, that examination threw new light onto Jesus' teachings. And the disciples were able to understand the teachings of Jesus in a new way that was not evident when they initially heard and saw them. So the Gospels need to be read in light of the death and resurrection. They are an explanation of the unexpected end of Jesus' life, and an attempt to explain this unexpected end. The Gospel of Mark gives us the best picture of how this re-examination of the life of Jesus in light of his death and resurrection took place. Here's the original ending of the Gospel of Mark. When the women looked up, they saw that the stone had been rolled back. It was very large. On entering the tomb, they saw a young man sitting on the right side, clothed in a white robe, and they were utterly amazed. He said to them, "Do not be amazed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, the crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. Behold the place where they laid him. But go and tell his disciples and Peter, he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him, as he told you." When they went out and fled from the tomb, they were seized with trembling and bewilderment. They said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. What we have here in the Gospel of Mark is the messenger in the tomb telling them that if they want to understand the message of the empty tomb and of the resurrection, that they have to return to Galilee. In other words, we have to go back where it all started, take a second and even a third look at the words, actions, and preachings of Jesus in Galilee, and then we can come to understand the empty tomb and what it means in regard to Jesus' death and resurrection. So before we even look at the preachings and actions of Jesus, we have to look at the death and resurrection. So that is what we're going to do. We're going to read the conclusion of the novel first, and then we'll read the rest of the novel, knowing what will happen in the end. By doing this, we can see the events of the novel and understand them better because we already know what the conclusion is. One other thing about the end of Mark. It ends in a very strange way. Mark ends with the phrase, "They said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid." This is a strange way to end the gospel, a gospel which supposedly means good news. If the message of Jesus is good news, then why were they afraid? And why does Mark end the gospel with these words? Mark is trying to capture for his reader how truly disconcerting the whole experience of Jesus' death and resurrection was for the first followers of Jesus. I mentioned earlier how much it was unexpected. This was not what they thought the Messiah would be. For the Jews of Jesus' time, there were various ideas of what the Messiah was supposed to be. They thought maybe the Messiah was going to be a great warrior or a king like David and lead them into battle against the Romans and against those people who oppressed them. Or possibly the Messiah was going to be a great high priest who was going to reinstate proper temple worship. This is what the Essenes were looking for. This is what the people of Qumran were looking for. And don't worry about it. I'll talk about them later. Some people thought it was going to be some heavenly figure. The book of Daniel talks about the Son of Man coming on a cloud. So they saw the Messiah as some heavenly figure with an army of angels behind them. Jesus was not a great warrior king. Jesus was not a great high priest. Jesus was not the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven. So he did not meet any of the perceived ideas at the time regarding the Messiah. Jesus had been killed by being crucified, which according to Jewish law meant that he was cursed. So for Jews, there was no way he could be the Messiah. The book of Deuteronomy says it very clearly. If a man guilty of a capital offense is put to death, and you hang him on a tree, his corpse shall not remain on the tree overnight. You must bury it the same day. Anyone who is hanged on a tree is cursed by God. You shall not defile the land which the Lord your God is giving you as a heritage. The book of Deuteronomy stated it very clearly. And the fact that A, Jesus had been convicted of a capital offense, and B, he had been hung from a tree, he had been crucified, and C, he therefore was cursed by God, meant that he couldn't be the Messiah as far as the Jews were concerned. St. Paul says it very clearly when he says the crucifixion is a stumbling block for Jews. Now you have this young man in the tomb, an apparent messenger of God, who says that God has raised Jesus from the dead. This action of God, this resurrection, is a justification of everything that Jesus did in his life. And it must mean that he wasn't cursed by God. The resurrection shows that he was blessed by God, not cursed. Again, realize how disconcerting this must have been for the followers of Jesus. Everything they thought they knew about the Messiah, everything they thought they knew about what the Messiah was supposed to be, was suddenly seen as incorrect. They not only had to go back and look at the life of Jesus in another way, but they also had to go back and re-examine their understanding of the Torah and the prophets and see that in a different way. Of course they felt fear and trembling. Of course the women went away feeling fear and were told that they said nothing to anyone. Their entire world had been turned upside down by the events of the last 3 days. To bring it into the present day, just think about what people are feeling now regarding social distancing and isolation under the threat of COVID-19. Everything is different. People are saying that nothing will ever be the same again. Of course, we are going to come back from this. Of course, we are going to experience our own resurrections. But the experience of COVID-19 will change us. We will look at the world in a different way. But there is hope. There is resurrection. And that's what the disciples had to do as well. The disciples had to learn to look at the world in a different way based on their experience of Jesus and the resurrection and the death. And to do that, they had to go back to Galilee to understand it.